So before we begin, I'd like to pay my acknowledgements to the unceded lands of the Nunwal and Ngambri people on whose land we meet. Also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and also to Torres Strait and other indigenous people in the room. Bulavinaka, everyone. Welcome. I'm Romitesh from Fiji, also a research fellow at the Department of Pacific Affairs, and it's my absolute pleasure to convene and facilitate this session. I've been asked to just give a small snippet of what we might be doing, so I thought I'll start with some provocations over the last 2 days. One question that stayed with me in the first panel yesterday on people-centered climate change action was by Belinda Ibai from Torres Strait Islands, where she asked a question about where are all the canoes? Are they all home? Are some missing? And who gets called home? And who has access to this family? And it has stuck with me, and I've been thinking about it. It feels like the right place to begin today, because when we talk about a family of nations, or the so-called rules-based order, or even the ICJ advisory opinion, we are talking about access, we are talking about recognition, but more importantly, we're talking about power. We are talking about who gets to be on the water, who is welcomed into the harbor, and who's left on the shoreline watching the large steel ships pass by. Also, during the keynote, Honorable Fiame gave us some very thought-provoking questions and interventions to sit with. She asked us to think carefully about the terms on which the Pacific is so often understood. And these are around vulnerability, about smallness, questions around development, about mobility and adaptation. See, in my mind, she unsettled the assumptions built into these words. She reminded us that movement is not always about freedom, that migration can also reveal deep inequalities that exist. It is about questions of dispossession, about choosing to stay has meaning too. So staying is a political claim. Staying can be about dignity, it can be about continuity, it can be also about refusing to accept. So in essence, what she told us is that sovereignty is a lived experience. It's not an event, it's a process. As an Indo-Fijian from Fiji and someone who's both a scholar of gender and power, who's engaged in activism in Fiji, in the pro-democracy struggles, in human rights, I hear all of this in a very grounded way. Questions about belonging, questions about voice, questions about recognition are never abstract questions. They are about history, and Anna and I constantly with Any Quiet talk about history and the importance history plays. They are about power. They are about they are about essentially who enters institutions through someone else's door, in someone else's language, on someone else's terms. So when we talk about the ICJ advisory opinion, the standard story is always a legal one. It's about treaties, it's about jurisdiction, it's about procedure, and it's about obligations. All of these matter. But I do not want to, and I think this panel, I know this panel, does not want to begin with the court. We want to begin with the classroom in Vanuatu. People we know, who are students, who are activists, these 27 students who formed the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, sat in a university classroom in Port Vila. They did not have the backing of the diplomatic corps. They did not have the backing of major global powers. What they had was the reality of the existential threat that was unfolding in their communities. And as Cynthia, the president of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, has written about this, growing up in Solomon Islands, climate change wasn't a dinner table conversation for her people. She said, we do not have this luxury. It is what lie awake worrying in the night. So it's about homes. It's about ancestral graves. It's about childhood villages. It's about places where identities are anchored, all at risk of being washed away. So that line actually for me cuts through a lot of this abstraction that surrounds climate law and climate diplomacy. It takes us to straight through this idea of lived reality of the crisis. It takes us to the intimacy of the fear that Cynthia talks about, to the weight of the home, to the weight of the identity, to the knowledge that is not a future problem waiting to be politely, waiting politely in the distance. It is already here. So the urgency of this crisis that confronts a lot of people in the communities. Because once we begin there, we lived with the lived harm, the lived attachment. The legal question opens something much larger, in my opinion. It becomes a question about whose futures are being protected, whose attachments are being recognized, whose losses are being normalized, and whose wards are treated as expendable. This advisory opinion sits in that space between legal obligation and lived dispossession of many of the communities who are at the front lines of this climate crisis. It sits in the space between climate justice and the right to remain. And I think this is where a lot of the climate security discourse misses the justice aspect of it, because it's so emergent and it's so important to be addressed. So from where and I think my fellow panel members stand, this is also where we have to widen the frame of this ICJ advisory opinion, because any serious conversation about international law, any serious conversation about justice and decolonization right now has to also grapple with the question of Palestine. Palestine has become a crucible for so many of the questions that haunt this moment. War, power, settler colonialism, scholarcide, the destruction of institutions and memory, the selective invocation of law, and the collapse of the moral credibility of the so-called rules-based order, on which this ICJ opinion actually sits upon. Rules for whom is the question I constantly grapple with, written by whom, enforced against whom, and suspended for whom. These are important questions we need to consider when we talk about the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. And from the Pacific, these questions are not distant. They resonate in places in our region that are still living with colonial rule, of occupation, of annexation, of ongoing militarization, of constrained sovereignty for people in Guam, for Kanaki, for West Papua, for Maui Nui, for Rapa Nui, for American Samoa, and elsewhere. These are the places where law, power, and recognition remain unresolved, where people continue to confront the unfinished business of decolonization, where people continue to confront the language of strategic interest, the language of security, the language of administration. And this too often sits over older struggles of land, of dignity, of self-determination, and of political voice. So for those of you in the room who come, and many of us actually our histories are shaped by empire, our histories are shaped by militarism, of racial hierarchy, and even ideas about uneven humanity. These are not side questions when we are discussing this ICJ advisory opinion. They go to the heart of what international law is, what international law permits, and what it refuses to see. Climate crisis, in my view, does not sit outside these structures. It is deeply embedded in these structures. It is entangled with them. The same global order that speaks of language of protection and produces abandonment, the same institutions that recognize certain harms can remain paralyzed, can remain evasive, and complicit before others. So when small Pacific Island states or large ocean states, when Pacific peoples go to the ICJ, this is not purely about climate change in the narrow sense. It is about entering a space that is marked by empire. It is entering a space that is marked by hierarchy, about languages that are foreign. And it's insisting on another moral and political horizon. So as someone who studies gender and power, I also see the international law has long privileged particular styles of authority. It tends to be most comfortable with the language of sovereign states. These are about control. These are about strategy, detachment, fluent in the idiom of the universality, universal claims. There is a masculine performance here as well, about command, about mastery, about control, relationality that is stripped of vulnerability. That performance travels easily into courtrooms and diplomatic halls. And Rebecca and I have talked about the images that came out of this while the court case was happening as well. So as I'm thinking here, as someone who's a product of indenture, of empire, for indigenous people, for colonized peoples, for communities whose histories do not fit neatly into these categories of international law order, legal order, the terrain has always been harder. People are heard, but often from edges of these international forums. They're invited in, but frequently as witnesses to suffering rather than authors of law or producers of theory. Their walls are mined for testimony, while the institution holds tight to its own foundations. So what these students did in the classroom at USP was different. They built their own canoe in Teresa Taylor's words. They did the relational walk. They gathered testimonies from their people, from their communities, from their elders. They carried the stories from their communities. They built bridges between grassroots realities and the language of high court procedure. They brought elders, they brought their ancestors, they brought obligations and oceanic ways of knowing with them. They brought a sense of responsibility to the land and the sea that did not begin with the international law and will not end there. And I think if you talk to the Pacific Island students fighting climate change, they talk about this, that this is just the first step. What happens next? And this is why Honorable Fiame's words at the keynote mattered so much. She reminded us that Pacific knowledge is not decorative. She highlighted the importance of academia, of universities, going beyond mere skills training. It is not there to add a bit of culture around the edges of what is considered real, what is considered a real argument. It carries authority. It shapes how people understand duty, continuity, relation, and future. And it shapes how sovereignty is lived and matters profoundly in this space. And this is where I think the canoe metaphor, I've been grappling with a lot with canoe because I'm teaching the Introduction to Pacific Studies as well. And this question cuts deep because this is the questions we've been grappling with in the Pacific Studies course. What does it mean to do relational learning? What does it mean to shift from what Teresia said, experts to experts in making? That we are constantly, because we are constantly learning and adjusting. So as these proceedings unfolded, I found myself watching something painful here. The richness, indigenous law, ancestral relations, obligations to place, those deeper ways of understanding continuity and justice got filtered. It got pressed into forms that the institution could recognize. And this is where we see the international rules-based order or formal institutions co-opting the language, but also minimizing what relationality means in practice, what identity means in practice, what is the connection to land and the sea. So by the time we arrive at the final opinion, some of that voices remained. A lot of the texture got thinned out in the process. A lot of what gave it force had to pass through the narrow gate of legal authority or legal legibility. And I think Anna and Dylan and Rebecca will go into this a bit deeper. So when we were asked yesterday by Belinda in the first panel, where are the canoes? I guess for this panel, I'm asking who in the Pacific actually can reach these institutions in ways that matter? Who has the resources in the Pacific? Who gets heard as the producer of knowledge? Who gets to shape the legal imagination? Who is still cast as a witness, informant, case study, or symbol? And for those living in spaces where law has never fully seen them, never fully protected them, or has in fact been part of the machinery of dispossession, what does it mean to place hope in these institutions? And these are some questions that, as Pacific Studies scholars, as scholars who engage in critical decolonial work, we have to constantly grapple with. So we are living in a moment of moral authority of the international order under enormous strain. Powerful states, we've seen time and time again in the last few years how powerful states have invoked the law when it suits them and evade it when it costs them something. Entire peoples have been made disposable in the full view, public view. Universities, archives, schools, hospitals, histories are being destroyed in the name of empire, in the name of militarization, in the name of war, in the name of resources and resource extraction. And the language of order continues to be untouched. So yes, I think Palestine has become one of those clearest tests of our times, and a lot of us in academia are complicit because we refuse to name and acknowledge this. But I think what we need to be grappling with also is, this is also a test of international law. This is a test of decolonization as a process, which is still incomplete. It's a test of whether climate justice can be separated from the wider struggles against war, against empire, against occupation, and against racialized abandonment. And from the Pacific, we know these questions very intimately. But our leaders, our academics, we are all complicit in reproducing these systems many times, over and over again, because we choose to demarcate, see climate change in a very separate sense as well. So when Fiji makes a statement at the ICJ in support of the climate decision, but then goes on the same hand to the ICJ supporting Israel, it is throwing the question about these institutions, the very nature of how it is affecting us as well. And we cannot ignore these questions. So in the middle of that, I think we have very young Pacific people. These are brown, black bodies. These are feminized. And what Honorable Fiame said yesterday is that we have to acknowledge our smallness, but also use that as our tool to redefine what it means. So what we need to do is also, these are extraordinary political acts that we need to grapple with, questions. It's also a very deeply Pacific question because it refuses the reduction of the region to a crisis and vulnerability. It insists that home matters, that staying matters, that belonging matters, that sovereignty is still lived. It reminds us that smallness does not mean insignificance, and these students have shown us this, and that Pacific peoples have never simply waited for the world to decide for the future, or for their future. Sometimes they have taken the bold steps and challenged institutions, challenged powers. So I hope today, as we transition into the panelists and their presentations, we can sit with the promise of this moment, but also the tensions that it brings out. And I hope we can recognize the immense labor that has made this possible, the students, the communities, the lawyers, but also our political leaders, while also asking the hard questions about the institutions they had to move through. I hope we can think carefully about what was carried into the law, what had to be translated, and what still remains on the shore. So with this, it's a nice segue into introducing Dr. Ana Naupa. She's a fellow, she's a sister, she's a fellow former PhD, struggling PhD from Vanuatu. Just finished and got the congratulatory email from ANU yesterday. And she will talk, I won't say much because you've heard Ana speak at this conference, but Ana will talk about culture and the important work she did for the Vanuatu government's case and also the MSG case on bringing this idea of culture and the non-economic loss and damage issue questions to the fore. So, Ana.
Can I just get a show of hands, please? How many of you have kind of engaged with conversations around culture and climate change and the intersection? Then I don't need to present. So the assumption that we have about how much do we know about the climate impacts on cultural change, on cultural loss is, I just realised this doesn't have my talking points. And I need to just get my laptop. Excuse me a moment. So taking a court case to the ICJ cannot rest on the assumption that there would be an understanding of what Pacific cultural systems look like. So when I was the lead author on the expert report on cultural loss and climate change in Vanuatu, together with my associate professor Chris Ballard from the School of Culture, History and Language here. And we were asked, I was asked to do this, and as any good PhD student knows, if you're going to get distracted from your thesis, you need to bring your panel along with you. And so I very strategically asked my supervisor, Chris, to join me in this journey. And we were asked to help rapidly prepare a report for the Vanuatu government's submission. And we had probably about 2 months in which to pull something together. Now, anyone who works in anthropology will know that we're talking about decades of work. So what we needed to do was bring in a lot of other researchers' work and speak to that and be very clear that what we were bringing was not direct testimony, which is often what people are looking for in court cases, but to show and illustrate a frame about how to understand culture and therefore cultural loss in the context of climate change. So what I'm going to be sharing is kind of how we went about building an understanding that could be used in Vanuatu's submission in presenting to the ICJ, so that when it spoke about what loss is, what impact is, there was a frame of reference that was very specific to our Pacific cultural systems, but particularly to how we are in Vanuatu. So I'm just going to go through a few points that I'm pulling out from the report to show how the expert report linked in to Vanuatu's submission in terms of framing what cultural loss looks like. And I'll let you read that there. But a fundamental message that we were trying to convey was to show how cultural systems, there's an entire cosmology. There's a whole way of life. There's a whole system. It's not simply artifacts or just a language or just a dance practice, but there was a whole system that is integrated with cultural and natural heritage, and that we couldn't separate these concepts from each other, and really speaking to it in an integrated way. And so, of course, in the Pacific region, and we've got Dr. Francis Koya here in the room, the Pacific Regional Cultural Strategy from SPC was a very important aid in this process, in helping show how the Pacific as a region, and therefore Vanuatu ourselves, we talk about culture in these very holistic, large ways. It's about belief systems, worldviews, philosophies. So when we start to then break it down from there as to how climate change is impacting all of this, what does that then look like? So for Vanuatu, for those who are not as familiar with my country, you can see we've got a lot of languages, not as many as Papua New Guinea, but when we look at our population size, and if language is a proxy for culture, then we have the highest cultural diversity per capita in the world. And we still have very vibrant Indigenous languages, practices, and as of government data there. And so, again, showing that this idea of cultural systems and what's at stake, it's very much the entire country, it's very much all the people, and it's all these ways of lives, and you can see the long list of all the different languages there. So we needed to establish that giant macro framing. Also, we needed to talk about how culture and knowledge is then expressed, and how this happens through an extensive body, excuse the misplaced quotation, through an extensive body of traditional ecological knowledge, and that it's developed over thousands of years. So it's recognising this long history that is attached to cultural systems. And so when these systems are impacted, we're also impacting this long history of knowledge and transfer and transmission. So to build that into the argument, we needed to demonstrate, and this is in the expert report, which you can read for yourselves, it's all online, but we needed to show and explain so that it could be very clear to those who are reading the submissions, oh, this is what this means. So what does the language, when we say language holds traditional ecological knowledge, what does it mean? How do we explain it? And I'm just giving you a lot of lovely pictures without going into that depth because of the time. But particularly I think what I want to show here is that we kept banging on the point that for Vanuatu society, there's an exceptional integration of culture and the environment, and this manifests in multiple ways. So for those who've always thought of climate as an environmental issue, we're bringing it into saying, no, it's all part of the way of life. It's affecting every fabric to keep with this weaving theme. And so we step out 4 areas in the expert report, and then the Vanuatu government was weaving it into their own legal case. And we step out, these trans-species relationships, the cultural resource security, the psychosocial fertility dynamics between people and environment, and then, of course, managing vulnerabilities and exposure to hazard risk, which is, the latter is possibly what people know the most, right? Like, how do you prepare for all those cyclones? What do you do after, your home and livelihoods have just been wiped out? But so we go through, and I'm going to show you lots of pictures because I want to convey, for those of you here in the room and those online, just this richness and colour of life and how we needed to put that in black and white print for faceless judges in a faraway court. How do you convey this richness and colour? And so, talking through, we would basically pull from a macro survey, if you like, of everything done about Vanuatu's cultures, environmental systems, biocultural knowledge, all of these, and mass this together to create a narrative that could be used in a legal case. So looking, as we can see with this example, sort of highlighting the importance of place, that when you have place and a sense of identity, it maps out your system of belonging, your role in life. I've used the picture of the breadfruit because there are different cultural groups in Vanuatu who use a totemic system where they might be from the breadfruit Naflak, for example, and then they have responsibilities and custodianship rights that go along with this particular crop. My own place, you have your tree, you have your fish, you have your bird, you have all these different relationships that you become custodian of. So we needed to bring this into the storytelling that we had. We wanted to convey the spirituality. How do we talk about spirituality in that very intangible space and bring that into how do you talk about climate impacts on something intangible? And how do you then measure that in a world where metrics is king, right? And so that was also part of how we go about it, but also talking about the knowledge that comes and the hundreds and thousands of years of learning to live with cyclones and knowing what to do immediately in the aftermath, how to find your disaster food when there's no more gardens, how to rebuild quickly so you have shelter. And so that takes us to this idea of cultural resource security. So how do we ensure that our bioresources, which are affected by changing patterns, changing climate patterns, there are, for the region as a whole, we're worried about the fish migrating eastwards and what that's going to mean for, fish-based economies and revenues for all the governments and countries in the Pacific. The same for landed species as well as our coastal and our fisheries. So what does it mean when our bioresources are under threat? What does it mean for our traditional architecture? What does it mean for our canoe building, our traditional modes of transport? What does it mean for traditional medicine? I chose a pawpaw because I couldn't think of another picture. But I also like this picture because you do know that when the pawpaw stem, it tastes horrible, but it's very good for you. What does it mean when we have all these things, and how do we map all of that out to then map out the climate impacts against them? And how does this relate to our place-based health if we have healthy access to food and livelihood, what does that then mean for the ability to reproduce the next generation of our lines? And what does that mean for where we can continue our different groups and our diversity? The one that I mentioned we know often we talk a lot about in all these climate change projects around the region is obviously around early warning systems, weather indicators, so knowing when the flowering of a tree changes or the birds are hatching too early or much later. All of these signals in the environment that also mean that life adjusts accordingly. All this knowledge, how that's affected and how it's changed by the way in which we look at and understand what we've received in terms of our own traditional scientific knowledge, and how that itself, that knowledge system itself, is impacted by climate change. So again, as we were going through building, so we're building up in the expert report, we're building up this frame to then be able to support the Vanuatu government to argue the points that it needed to argue. And, as you can, I'll let you read here what it says, but particularly then, well, how do we talk about loss and damage? And how do we say that this is now already happening? And how do we say that this is happening also, as Romitesh has pointed out, in a context of already great colonial empire-based disruptions that have happened over only the last 2 centuries. And now we also have these climate events. So the next part of the report goes into, showing how cultural loss, therefore, is an insecurity. And you can see here Climate Minister Ralph Regenvanu speaking with the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate and Human Rights, Dr. Elise Mongera. This was before the submission was made, and a chief from Pele there, Ireland, but talking about what it means for people and place and mobility and movement. We then went into many, many, many examples of where climate change and climate impacts, and not always direct, sometimes indirect, are then affecting place, society, cultural systems, and access to livelihoods and so on. So this example here that we took is climate-fueled landslides. So basically continuous heavy rain events, loosen the topsoil, 3 kilometres of village, gardens, homes, spiritual sites, graves, all gone. Many people talk about coastal erosion, sea surge, how it affects our coastal heritage, our graveyards, and many other spiritual and traditional sites. We talked about how new climate change-induced invasive species were destroying the coconut culture on Efate Island, where Port Vila is. And this is work done by SPC, which was very helpful for our case. So we reached out into crop agencies as well to help gather as much as we could to set up this expert report. And to show that when you start to lose your coconuts, what kind of Pacific Islander am I if I can't eat a coconut? I didn't have a coconut growing in my garden for 5 years. It feels really weird. For those who are from Fiji, you know your sasa broom? I can't even make a sasa broom. So, and it has these deep impacts because then there's the coconut naflak. For Jenny from Efate Island, she understands, it has a cascading effect into what it then disrupts in a cultural system. So we needed to show these things. Now, of course, we have PDNAs, which are really important, and and often are very typically focused on the economic assessment. Can we put a value against the loss that's happened? And it doesn't really touch on the cultural aspects of things, intangible or tangible, which of course is an opportunity, right, for us to do that. And we know from the presentation yesterday from Philomena Nelson from SPREP, they're doing some really important work around non-economic loss and damage and helping step out how we might think about cultural loss and damage. But again, this is examples of how the reef and the coastal fisheries are affected by climate change, what that means for food sources and food continuity. So we kept building this case to show these examples, which fundamentally making this point that there are these, as climate change as a force multiplier produces cascading impacts on culture, and at each point may not be immediate, it may have a longer horizon, but it is happening. And so I just wanted to, I'm about to wrap up, but I wanted to share a thing about how this question of resilience was, how do we talk about it when we're trying to say to these faceless people in a world court that, yes, resilience is part of who we are. We would not, as someone said yesterday, we would not still be here if we were not resilient after all the events of, even just the last 200 years. But so how do you talk about resilience without giving a free pass to those who are trying to hold morally and historically responsible? So we had these conversations with the legal team that was supporting the Vanuatu government, and we said, well, how do we approach this? Because there is inherent resilience built into our cultural systems. But we don't want to, and the lawyers were saying, yeah, but we don't want to show that it's okay because then they're absolved. We don't want to absolve anyone. We need to show that, is there a way to talk about resilience that still shows how resilience itself is impacted by climate change? And that was the point we then made, is we do have resilience. It's built into our systems of adaptation, but our resilience itself is overwhelmed and under siege by climate change. Why? Because the traditional scientific knowledge we might have about what to do after a disaster, which foods to eat and so on, those foods themselves are under threat. Our resilience to go to those foods, we have that knowledge, it shifts because now that's not growing the same way. So there's this, the resilience itself is under threat, which is a very tricky line, right, to think about, and I can see you're all kind of thinking it through in your heads, but please hold on to it. So the Vanuatu submission, really argued strongly for the right to culture. It said it's protected under customary international law, but, here's the but, we are all so proud of those young students and our governments and all the allies and everyone who helped, the academics, who helped push and make history. And it is wonderful, truly proud. But cultural loss was simultaneously a central argument to the submission to the ICJ, and yet it was omitted from direct attention in the final ruling. So what happens? What happens now? We've articulated our systems. We've articulated how they're affected by loss, climate-induced loss and damage. But it still doesn't have that recognition that we had hoped would come through in the ICJ ruling. Now, the ruling is still really good, do not get me wrong, but we still need to go further. And this comes to Romitesh's points that he's asked about, what's not happening, or where do we need to go further. Now, the Vanuatu government, talked about the ruling as a sword and a shield. And he said it's a sword to hold, obviously, the world to account and recognise historical responsibility. It's also a shield to protect ourselves, to be able to use use the sword, but to also then protect what we have and give us the space and time to really push for what we have. So this is my post-ICJ opportunity, which I'm really glad that SPREP and colleagues, SPC, Vanuatu government are really leaning into around the non-economic loss and damage, and being able to articulate this, help frame it and talk about it in a way that has meaning for our communities, all our communities, not only those most affected, but also gives us the space and time to work through to do it in a very thoughtful and considered way. Now, Our expert report for the Vanuatu submission was a 33-page, we had to really condense it down with lots of references, but it ended up being a 33-page obituary of cultural loss. So our next step is to take forward this non-economic loss and damage work. It's certainly not going to happen through the ICJ, but what it does do is it gives us a direction and a way that we've already articulated it to keep walking that journey, but finding other pathways. Thank you.
So this brings to an end the non-legal side of the conversation. Now we get into the sort of the law, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rebecca Monson from the law school here at ANU. Won't say much, but she teaches, researches, and does policy work around social inequality, natural resource government, emergency management, and justice systems in Australia and the Pacific. And she will talk about what does it mean,
That's a good
the
question.
decision. Yeah.
Afternoon, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who've cared for this place that we now often call Canberra for many thousands of years, because as Anna reminded us, and what a line, an obituary of cultural loss. As many people in this room know, discussions of climate change, including the AO, cannot be divorced from processes of colonisation. So in a paper published last week in Nature Climate Change, Cynthia Honuhi, John Handmer and I argue that although the ICJ-AO has been very rightly celebrated, there were many, many wins in it. It also reveals, as Anna has just told us as well, the persistent failure of the international system to recognise Indigenous laws, knowledges and practices. Today I want to situate the arguments we make in that paper within a body of literature that I've been trying to think with to understand what happened a bit more, on prefigurative legalities or efforts to imagine law otherwise. And I do so because I have a hunch, I have a bit of a hunch that this work might be useful for thinking about the lessons of the AO and how to build collaborations that take us towards climate justice. So across the Pacific, we find movements that engage with legal systems in very diverse ways, but often with a common goal of expanding and reworking the state-based order inherited from the colonial administrations. In the 2000s, when I started my PhD and career, academics, at least in Australia, tended to see these movements as resisting or rejecting state ordering, or alternatively as, quote, hybridising the local arena with the state system. And what I mean by this is that there's been a tendency to focus on either rejection of the state or on how the state travels into the local rather than how custom and the local might travel into international arenas, which I think is what we saw in the AO. So these narratives that I'm talking about really peaked in the 2000s. Australian scholars often looked at what was occurring in Bougainville or Solomon Islands and elsewhere, and they talked not only about failed states, but also about a rejection of law, or phrases we see are, the law doesn't have any resonance for Pacific people. But one of the things I find interesting about this inspiring bunch of then young students and now professionals building their legal careers often that emerged from USP was that this is absolutely not what they were expressing. In fact, we see quite the opposite. So for example, Cynthia Honuhi has always stressed the origins of the movement in an environmental law classroom, and she's frequently told the media that we're doing this because, quote, we believe in the rule of law. So this is not a rejection of law that we are seeing here. And I want to suggest that PIS, FCC and possibly other movements in the region might be better understood in terms of prefigurative legalities, in terms of movements that are trying to imagine law otherwise. And here I'm drawing particularly on legal scholars Bronwyn Morgan and Amy Cohen, who are both at UNSW. none of this scholarship has been thinking through the Pacific. It's been overwhelmingly focused on urban contexts in the global north, but I'm interested in what their ideas might help us do. And they similarly note that in the fields they draw on, a lot of legal research has been interested in movements that either confront and reform state power or alternatively create radical alternatives without engaging the state, so that resist and refuse the state. And Morgan and Cohen are interested in groups that bridge this divide, in groups that don't primarily lobby the state, but they do use some legally inflected tools and forms to enact their own understandings of legality. And they give us this typology for understanding prefigurative legality. So pluralism, I'm not going to talk about that. I think we see that in all movements across the region. I'm interested more in the ideas of like movements that act as if they have power. They cultivate different ways of being and relating to law while simultaneously insisting that these ways of being always have existed. They act notwithstanding. Social actors will themselves to have power, and they invest energy and activism into legal forms and logic, even though they're really dissatisfied with the status quo. And they act anyhow and in case. And we have lots of quotes from Honourable Ralph Reagan-Vanu and many other leaders who say, well, you know, we know the law might not work, but we've got to try everything. We're acting anyhow and in case. So we can probably all think of movements across the region that are mostly engaged in non-legal work, but which also engage with legality to construct alternative understandings of governance, of groups that act as if they do in fact already have power, and groups that act anyhow and in case without knowing whether and where that work is going to go. And I want to just draw on this framework to think through some of the things, or at least some of my observations of PIS, FCC and the campaign for an AO. And my observations come purely as an outsider. Unlike Dylan and Anna, I was not involved in it. So I've really just watched it through media, online, watching the submissions to the court and things like that. And I want to highlight two things. First, the role of time, ancestors and ancestrally received knowledge, which has been completely neglected by legal scholars so far, and even I think in this language of prefigurative legalities, like it's very forward-looking, it's not drawing from the past. And second, the role of power, which Romitesh has already really directed our attention to. So a lot of the work on prefigurative legality neglects this, and I think we sometimes neglect it in Pacific studies too. But it's the only way I can understand what I think I might have seen in the ICJ proceedings over time. So in the early years of the ICJ AO campaign, it was very much Pacific driven, especially by Vanuatu and Pacific Island students fighting climate change. Importantly, the law students did not just draw on the language of international law, but they were working hard to disrupt, diversify and expand it. And they placed the arts and embodied expressions of culture at the absolute centre of their work. Similarly, when we look at the hearings that occurred at the end of 2024, expressions of Indigenous sovereignty, custom and law were very prominent. So Pacific speakers appeared before the court adorned with flowers, shells and weaving. We saw numerous women speaking to the court, and there were frequent references to ancestors, the more than human world and Indigenous legal norms. These aren't just, I'm speaking to the converted in this room, but to state the obvious, these are not just evocative expressions of culture that are designed to persuade and move the court. They're assertions of authority and law. And unfortunately, Cynthia couldn't be with us this week, but I'm going to bring her into the room with us by reminding us all what she said to the court.
I thank Professor Marinki Singh. I now give the floor to Ms. Cynthia Honiwuni. Madam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court. My name is Cynthia Rosa Barianga Haka Honiuhi. I am from Makira and South Malaita in the Solomon Islands. Within my blood flows the collective memory of my ancestors, Huta'a, who were conceived from the divine law, Warato'o, and have thrived on our islands since time immemorial. I stand before you not as an individual, but as the living embodiment of the voices of our people, past, present, and future. I also have the honor to address you as President of the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change, the youth organization that began the campaign to bring climate change before you. 5 years ago, I was one of those students who together dreamed up a plan to seek an advisory opinion from this court and brought that dream to the government of Vanuatu. 29 years ago, when this court considered the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, a Masalis mother stood where I'm standing now, Lee John Ekni Lang. She was a survivor of the US nuclear weapons testing program, which unleashed 67 nuclear weapons upon her homeland and her people. She appeared before this court to share the grave injustice inflicted upon her life, her nation, and our region, all in the spirit of contributing to the vision of a peaceful and better world. I am here to do the same. For my people, our land, Mako, is the most precious. Land is our mother, a living, timeless plane where generations past, present, and future converge, interconnected, and sustained in an unbroken cycle of life. It is upon our land that our values and principles are rooted, preserved, and transmitted across generations. Our land stretches to the distant waters where the shark Paiawa swims, rises to the heights where the eagle Huara soars, spans the rivers traversed by the crocodile Huara, and reaches into the depths of soil where the snake Moa burrows. For my Areare people, the birthright custodians, Reoni Mai Noni, walk in sync with our clan totems, Reoni Mai, to safeguard the fundamental relationship with the divine law, Warato'o, land, Mako, and people, Noni. My people understand the continuous duty of past and present generations to protect the environment for the future generations, Kiramo. It is the adherence to this duty that enabled my people to live and thrive in harmony with our environment. This duty, Arata Inoni o Anaha, is our understanding of the legal principle of intergenerational equity. Climate change is undermining our ability to uphold this sacred contract. My people's land of Whanalei is nearing a critical point on the verge of being completely engulfed by the rising seas. Without our land, our bodies and memories are severed from the fundamental relationship that defined who we are. Those who stand to lose are the future generations. Their future is uncertain, reliant upon the decision-making of a handful of large emitting states which, as my colleagues explained, are responsible for climate change. These states have not only enabled, but proactively encouraged the production and consumption of fossil fuels and continue to do so today. When the Paris Agreement was concluded, the youth of the world looked up to it as an instrument of hope. Today, the entire COP process has been hijacked by large emitters and major fossil fuel producers, turning it into a polluter-safe harbor and a trap for everyone else. No good faith understanding of the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement can be consistent with the conduct of large emitters. By depriving the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and COP process of any good faith, meaning these states have turned all three against their spirit. For my people and for the world's youth and future generation, the consequences are existential. As judges of the World Court, you possess the power to renew the power to help us course correct and renew hope in humanity's ability to address the greatest challenge of our time. And you can do this simply by applying international law to the conduct responsible for climate change. Palahenga, Chiana, and thank you.
So we see that references to the ancestors are very prominent in Cynthia's statement to the court, and many other Pacific advocates also invoked the ancestral to explain their authority to advocate and their visions for the future. And this is ontological work. These claims were aimed to unsettle the very foundations of the legal systems that have emerged through colonisation. So, for example, Cynthia emphasises the collective and more than human world entanglements that might disrupt Western property rights. And this takes me to questions of power, which she also mentioned and which Romitesh has highlighted for us. Because in some versions of legal scholarship, and as we've said, possibly even some versions of Pacific studies, there's a tendency to assume that it's enough to bring Indigenous law and knowledge before the court or before another forum. That is in and of itself a radical act that is going to transform the system. But what we saw in the ICJ processes over time was a progressive marginalisation of the plural Indigenous and ancestral conceptions of law. I want to stress here again that I speak just as an outsider observer. And what I saw was that as the campaign became more successful, as it attracted more attention across the world, it also attracted increasing attention from powerful international non-governmental organisations, from major cashed-up global north law firms, and from elite international lawyers. And when the opinion was delivered in early 2025, so remember I said we saw this celebration and assertion of authority in the court at the end of 2024, but when the opinion was delivered in 2025 in the Great Hall of the ICJ, the room was primarily occupied by non-Pacifica lawyers, and the region was predominantly, not only, but predominantly represented by men who were markedly wearing black suits as compared to what had been worn during the hearings. And among lawyers, we tend to see this takeover by non-Indigenous lawyers as blatant careerism. Some people are simply jostling to be in front of the cameras in one of the most powerful arenas in the world to build their own profiles. And sure, there's some of that going on, but I think this analysis is too simplistic. What we also saw was the persistent power of Anglo-American norms and orders. So, for example, in the Great Hall of Justice, where the court sits, there's limited space and limited tickets. And there were lawyers who arrived in the campaign relatively late in the process who were quite comfortable holding those coveted tickets on the day that the opinion was delivered. And they were comfortable with this precisely because of their legal epistemologies and even ontologies. To give an example, they probably understood themselves as the lawyers appearing for states and delivering the arguments for states to be the most legitimate representatives of these states. This does make total sense if you're operating only within Anglo-American legal traditions. But many of us here might think that an Indigenous citizen of that state might be a more appropriate representative to sit in the courtroom on the day the opinion is delivered. So this cuts to the heart of legal conceptions of representation, belonging, and citizenship, the questions raised by Romitesh. And it's not only about radically different understandings of representation, belonging, and citizenship. It's about power, because questions of who did and didn't end up in the Great Hall on the day the opinion was delivered were bound up with choices to prioritise some legal concepts, orders, and knowledges over others. And sometimes this happened because of the sense of urgency that people had. There was a sense of needing to get the best lawyers in the room. But these exercises of power, the practices of erasure and exclusion can't guide us towards climate justice. They literally reproduce the practices of the colonising fossil fuel-driven economy they purport to critique. They extract knowledge from Pacific people in order to serve careers and agendas in the global north. And so this takes us beyond just the legal concepts and theory that seem to have been the forefront of a lot of the strategizing, and it takes us to questions of legal professional practice. The question of who remains in control of a project determines how prefigurative it can be and how effective the reimagining, the making law otherwise can be. And there's no time to keep ceding the space to those who are not committed to decolonisation. Thank you.
Lastly, we have Dylan. Dylan is from, he's a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of Auckland and currently pursuing his PhD as well in the University of Melbourne Law School. He is Samoan, of Samoan descent, but also was born in Nam and was raised in Aotearoa. And he was part of the Cook Islands delegation who made representations on behalf of the Cook Islands at the ICJ.
Talofa lava, everyone. I want to acknowledge the unceded sovereignty and the enduring laws of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and express solidarity with ongoing struggles for sovereignty and self-determination from the settler state of so-called Australia. So for my spiel, I'm going to explore how we might understand the ICJ Climate Advisory Opinion in times of crisis. And by times of crisis, I'm not just referring to the climate crisis or the triple planetary crisis, but what we might call the crisis of international law, where, to put it mildly, international law doesn't mean much really. Colonial states like so-called Australia, New Zealand, and the US aren't really pretending anymore to care about it, or doing so half-heartedly, knowing that no one kind of takes them seriously anymore when they do invoke international law, from the Paris Agreement to the Genocide Convention. And as Rom so powerfully said, it's weaponized. International law is weaponized only insofar as it allows empire to continue its genocidal bombardments, dispossession, and environmental degradation. And it's important to note, as Roms did, when it comes to the Genocide Convention or customary international law obligations to prevent genocide, it's becoming clear that international law doesn't mean much to Pacific nation states either, and that there is an egregious selectivity when it comes to which advisory opinions from the ICJ matter and which ones don't. So that's broadly what I mean by times of crisis. And regarding the climate advisory opinion, what I want to roughly suggest, an emphasis on roughly, is that for us as Pacific peoples and our allies, one of the key takeaways from the advisory proceedings, the opinion text itself, and the aftermath since it was released, the opinion came out, is that we need to urgently escalate our strategies for climate justice by dismantling the current system of international law and work together to imagine and build something new. To make this very bold suggestion and to try to get you all to understand where I'm coming from, I'm going to go through what I think are the insurmountable limits of the advisory opinion, the ICJ itself, and multilateralism and international law more broadly in this time of crisis. And to do this quickly, I'm going to start by showing how in the proceedings, Pacific peoples made innovative arguments invoking Pacific laws, custom, and tradition. And I'll suggest how we can maybe read these arguments as brave calls for the court to recognize and even apply a new or radically different kind of international law that reconceptualizes the relationships and obligations between human beings and our living environment and Earth. Then I want to outline, or speculate really, how there are signs in the opinion text and in some of the separate judgments from some of the judges that suggest that the court, while it did not take up these calls or respond to them clearly, was still deeply moved by them in rendering its historic opinion, but was ultimately limited in what it could say as a court of law, as the judicial organ of the UN, but in its own subtle way made its own call or gentle suggestion for the world, including the Pacific, to create a new international law. And then I'll briefly touch on how, since the opinion was handed down, this call from the court and the calls made by Pacific peoples in their arguments doesn't seem to have been heard or taken up by Pacific states, organizations, or civil society, where we are seeing a regression back to multilateralism, a reliance on COP and the General Assembly, and the same structures that have never and will never serve us. Something that I think, well, for many of us is so glaringly obvious today, but it's a reality that I'm concerned many of us in the region are ignoring. So to start with, Pacific people's arguments and how we might read them as a call for a new international law. Rebecca played Cynthia's incredible address for Vanuatu in the MSG, and I just want to highlight, just on the slide, that Cynthia didn't start with or center international law like many lawyers and diplomats did in the proceedings and continue to. She began with her own people's divine law and told the court of how her law informs her people's understanding of mainstream international law principles and doctrine. And there are other many examples in Pacific states and organizations, arguments, and I went through Vanuatu's, but just one other one that I want to highlight is from Tuvalu's written statement. And so at the outset in paragraph 4, they foregrounded their arguments, legal arguments in response to the question with the Tuvaluan concept of whenua, acknowledging it's a concept that the court and mainstream international law may not recognize or may not be legible to them, but centering it nonetheless and asserting that the fundamental rights of peoples to self-determination and subsistence under international law must account for this inextricable relationship between the islands and the experience of Tuvaluans as indigenous people. So like Cynthia, asserting Pacific law and custom at the core, not asking for the court to recognize it because it exists and persists and endures regardless of its recognition, but making clear that this is the lens, this is how they're coming to the court. And something I want to note here is that, of course, we know Pacific peoples and indigenous peoples around the world, they've always invoked their laws and customs in international fora, procedurally and substantively, from the 1920s petitions to the League of Nations against colonial administrations, to the petitions in the 1950s to the UN Trusteeship Council against nuclear testing. And of course, in COPs in various ways, we see indigenous laws and traditions and customs being invoked, probably most explicitly or formally of the Taunoa Dialogue in 2018. And we also have the BB&J agreement recognizing indigenous laws as well. But I think there's something different and remarkable with what happened in the proceedings and what we saw with some of Pacific people's arguments. Again, they weren't calling for the court to recognize or to bring Pacific laws or customs within the umbrella of mainstream international law, or asking it to integrate it to understand or interpret states' obligations under treaties and customary international law. But to me, they were inviting the court to redefine and reconceptualize international law and to maybe go a step further, call on it to recognize a different kind of international law altogether. But like I mentioned, the court didn't do this in the advisory opinion text. It didn't mention or apply any of the Pacific or indigenous laws or customs that were invoked before it. And like Anna so powerfully said, it didn't acknowledge or take up Vanuatu's incredibly robust arguments around cultural loss either. But I do want to speculate today that the court was still inspired and moved by these calls and the arguments and testimonials from Pacific peoples, and that there are hints in the opinion text and separate judgments that hint that this was the case. It may not have been explicit, but I think with the strong findings that they had, that they were inspired. But before I get to those hints, something I want to share as someone who worked in the proceedings is that, well, many of us in the Pacific, we knew that our arguments were the best, that international law and science was on our side. The historic outcome that we saw last year, it was never guaranteed. And we were very much going into the delivery thinking that could go either way. And this is because even though the arguments from Australia and other major emitting states, while they were egregious, they did technically make some sort of sense. And so many of us were expecting some sort of middle ground, or the court to take some sort of middle ground and concessions to those states. And of course we knew, we've seen in the past, the ICJ render disappointing advisory opinions and rulings for the Pacific around nuclear weapons. And so many of us, we managed our expectations and were preparing for the worst. So when the opinion was read out and released, we were shocked at how much we got, and the court's strong and unequivocal language around fossil fuels, human rights, and reparations, for example. And for me, in rereading and studying the opinion today, I think the findings and the language tell us that the court was deeply moved by the Pacific and the wider global South. Because if you can imagine as well what it must have been like for the judges of the court, with the biggest proceedings in the court's history, they had to sit and listen to arguments from 107 states and organizations, 10 full days. I think they only had 90-minute breaks, which means they had to listen to many Western European diplomats and lawyers from major emitting states delivering very much the same arguments, asking the court to keep the status quo and to limit everything to the UNFCCC and COPs. But then in these 10 days, or across these 10 days, maybe once or twice a day, the court got to hear from peoples from the Pacific and the global South, standing before them with grace and humility to call on them to render opinion centered on climate justice by sharing heartbreaking but inspiring stories of loss, devastation, courage and strength, and foregrounding their people's laws and customs in doing so. So I can imagine, even for the most conservative and hardened judges in the court, that these stories got to them and inspired and emboldened them to support the strong and unanimous opinion that they did. But like I mentioned before, even though it was strong, the court didn't mention or apply custom or redefine or transform international law, like some Pacific peoples invited them to. But I do just want to quickly say that in the separate judgment, so not the main text which carries the weight, we do see hints of certain judges being inspired and wanting to pay tribute to the immense effort of Pacific peoples in preparing and sharing their customs and traditions. So Judge Charlesworth, who many of us know, wouldn't be surprised that she, in her separate judgment, acknowledged and quoted many different Pacific peoples' testimonials and acknowledged their laws. But this didn't make it through to the main opinion. Also, I want to acknowledge the separate opinion of Judge Bandari from India, who didn't mention Pacific custom, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that he was inspired by folks like Cynthia and others to draw on his own traditions and customs, Hindu customs, and saying at its heart, this opinion speaks to the future of our planet, our shared Bhumi Devi, Mother Earth, the foundation and sustainer of all life. Kind of out of character for a judge to kind of speak about their own people's laws in that way, but I think that when you're sitting and you hear people like Cynthia and so many others, when you're reading testimonials from Vanuatu and the MSG, that you're moved to kind of reciprocate in this particular way. But yeah, in the main opinion itself, the court very much stuck to mainstream international law. But in the very last paragraph in the opinion, I think there is a gentle suggestion that it may have wanted to do more and go further than it did, but it couldn't because of its legal and technical constraints as a court of law. And sorry, it's a lot of text. I want to kind of read it out to you, but it's the very last paragraph, and I would say it's quite out of character for the court as well to express itself in such a, I think, poignant and emotional way. So it acknowledges, before concluding, the court recalls that it has been suggested that these advisory proceedings are unlike any that had previously come before the court, but it is limited with its judicial function. And so what's clear is that climate change is more than just a legal problem. It can't just provide a legal advisory opinion that will solve everything. It is very much bound by international law. It cannot apply the customs that may be presented to it in testimonials. And they acknowledge that law is not the answer. A complete solution to this daunting and self-inflicted problem requires contributions from all fields: law, science, economics. And above all, a lasting and satisfactory solution requires human will and wisdom at the individual, social, and political levels to change our habits, comforts, and current ways of life to secure a future for ourselves and those yet to come. And so it says at the end that it hopes, with what it puts forward in the opinion, that it can be used to guide social and political action. And so what I'm trying to say, sorry if I'm being a bit confusing, is that the court, I think, was mindful that a lot of the Pacific and Global South advocates were really asking it to do a lot, but acknowledged that in order to maintain its legitimacy within the international legal order and to abide by its technical functions, it can only say so much. But it's on the people of the world, including the Pacific, to transform the international law, to transform the world and its international law that it can then interpret. So I'm running out of time, but what I want to say or suggest at the end is that this kind of gentle suggestion from the court hasn't been taken up. We're seeing a regression in climate justice strategy. I would say a significant retraction in the bold imaginations our Pacific youth instilled in us, rather than the escalation and radical revolutionary political, social and political action that this moment demands of us. And at the last COP, we saw major emitting states do what they always do, and what multilateralism allows by design, which is exert pressure and influence to ensure that there was no mention of the advisory opinion in the decision text, and in the process of the negotiations that the bold findings of the court were essentially rendered null. It's almost like the advisory opinion didn't happen at all, and all this immense effort from the Pacific, from the Global South, amounted to nothing. And that's what I think we're going to see always at COP. It's what it's designed to do. And I want to suggest that there's no logical reason or serious basis to believe that this year's COP or any other COP will be any different. There's that quote about insanity and doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But I think there's deeper questions here about responsibility and moreover, irresponsibility that we need to attend to and confront. And as Epeli Hauofa warned us back in the 1980s, we need to grapple with the work of Pacific elites, class hierarchies, and aid and development arrangements in keeping the Pacific tethered. The Pacific tethered to and dependent on unjust systems and structures like international law and even the nation-state form, which will never give us justice, but have and are destroying us. So I'll end there. Thanks so much for listening.
Okay, yeah, there. Thank you to the panel again for yet another awesome insights into, well, in this case, the ICJ. This question is actually fair, Anna. You talked in your presentation about there's obviously there's so many other instances, but two examples you had were there's different flowering times and different nesting times for birds as well. And so for a lot of, I think, Pacific Island cultures, language is tied to the environment. And what sort of change is language undergoing, and is part of that cultural loss a loss of words if tuna is no longer taking the same paths it used to, if flowers are popping up in September when they're meant to in November, and things like that? How much of that cultural loss is a loss of language and a loss of words that no longer are relevant?
Thanks. When I gave a similar presentation at the law school here, it was, I think, last year after the the judgment, the ruling came out, I talked about how lawfare and engagement in these international legal processes, it takes up so much time, as we can see, and as we've heard. And it takes up so much critical energy that the words that Dylan left us with just in his last remarks, that echo Apelli how often, like we've got work to do at home, right? And we're taken away from our important work around vernacular languages, around our cultural systems, around helping, nothing is fixed, but helping the transitions go smoothly so we're not losing the knowledge that we've had for generations. So that's the really tricky question for all our Pacific Island countries, in that in engaging in these international processes, we leave a vacuum at home. And so what we're seeing in terms of language erosion, and there's different views around the region. In my country, I gave the data around vernacular, what's spoken. Myself, I don't speak my own father's language fully. I have a half knowledge of it, and I speak 3 other languages too. But I think, one of the part of what the challenge is how do we keep the interest in language, because we're becoming so globalized and modernized that people actually park this knowledge to speak the English, to speak the French, to engage in these international spaces, which is also important, but it's not the only thing. And that's the work we still have to do at home and be given the space and time. But because of the urgency of the crisis, we don't get that space and time. And I just want to make a plug for the ANU School of Culture, History and Language. I've now moved into a different college, but I do, because the ANU is one of the world premier places for Pacific linguistics. And it's thanks to the work that has been invested in this institution that we're able to work with all these language groups across the Indonesia, Papuan region, across Melanesia, across the Pacific, that have been, I think we need to keep doing that work.
Good afternoon, I think it is now. Barbara from the Torres Strait Islands. Just first and foremost, thank you so much for the reference to the canoes and what was said in the first session yesterday. When delivering that analogy, just totally with the force of my ancestors, reclaiming our connections, and totally this session, I came in very early and sat completely in the middle because I knew I would be gifted with so much alignment in what you're all saying. Would totally love to connect in with our journey that we're doing in our little dugout. We've just started digging it out for this journey. I've been sitting in front of my elders for the last few years with them asking, where are they? Where is everyone? What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And the analogy of, and this is why I shared it yesterday, was them saying, well, we can't see too much. We need to go out into the ocean and find where the rest of the flotilla is. I just wanted to share one thing. Everything was, really amazing, what was just shared and aligned, but this thing about resilience, as long as we're going to be changing the narrative and decolonising the narrative, I think we need to, or I would welcome people to consider that word resilience. Perhaps it's redundant. Maybe the word that we're needing to use is no longer resilience, but we demand and expect safety in everything that we're going through, especially in this time in history. It's existential. It's time to use words that are certain for our future and not that we're just surviving, that we're paddling and we're going to be okay, because we are as strong as we have always been, and we do have the spirit of our ancestors in amongst us. Thank you.
All right, I'll go ahead. Thank you so much. Thank you, Romitesh, and thank you to the panel. My question actually was for Anna, who I see is about to leave. Sorry, I'm gonna try and make it quick, but I also have a comment for Dylan. So it really is around this idea of the qualitative nature of all things culture, And, as you say, where data is king, and statistics are really important. They're really looking to quantify. So there's a project that I was involved in about a decade ago called Reweaving the Ecological Mat, and it was with the Pacific Theological College at the time. I was still at USB before I jumped into the devil's arena, the development space, now at SPC. But an important component, I think, of that was beginning to think about a concept I'd never heard of before called intemerate values. And we had, of course, an economist come in, and they had formulas and all of that, and he tried to explain to us what ecological accounting looked like and how that might be adapted to the cultural context. And talked about models used elsewhere in the world where you use 7 generations, etc., where the example that you used of the coconut tree, and you look at every aspect or dimension of cultural life that is now going to be affected, from livelihoods to health to security, etc., and you begin the painstaking journey of trying to monetize and quantify. And then you say, okay, an EIA, an environmental impact assessment, must be coupled with a culture impact assessment. And now we say, you want to put up a factory, you want to do this is the quantification of that. And it sounds all well and good, but of course it's a very long, tedious process. Ecological accounting has been around for a really long time, and I think it really is heartbreaking to not hear the regions speak about it in a purposeful way. Because I think that as someone who's engaged in the culture space and continues to champion in the space through the 2050 and, of course, the PRCS, thank you for that, it's emotive. It's seen as soft and fluffy and therefore easily dismissed. And it's only when we begin to use the language. In English, some of you will remember, we studied registers and the language of advertising and the language of and all of that. Until and unless we can use the appropriate legal language and the appropriate financial language, the capitalist language, for culture in a way that the global north understands, only then will we be sitting at the table and having the same conversation. Because right now they're talking about commercial and economic value, and we're talking about survival, our connection to the past and the future, existential crisis. That is not even featuring on the radar when it is a capitalist agenda, when it is about money. And so my question to Anna is, in the work that you have been doing, have you begun to see an interest in that? And is that potentially something, because you talked about it, the report almost being an obituary, and I'm thinking, what a rich repository of sovereign data for Vanuatu to begin that process, to begin to say, okay, we made a case, it didn't appear in the final report, but now we've begun this process to show you what it will really cost, not just us, but the world, because we know climate change, like the ocean crisis, doesn't know any boundaries. So that was my question for Anna. And my second comment was to Dylan. I didn't want to, not to burst your bubble, you spoke quite positively about the BB&J. I've been involved in the BB&J since 2019 as one of the regional advisors for PIFs through SPC, advising on traditional knowledge. PSIDS, the Pacific SIDS, played a really key role in bringing traditional knowledge, indigenous peoples, into the text. Great win, just like the ICJ, worthy of celebration. Come PrepCom and the conversations now, getting to implementation stage, and then the real agendas start rearing their heads. It's one thing to get it in the text, it's another thing to actually bring it to fruition and reality. Now is the pushback. Why traditional knowledge? Why culture? Why should indigenous peoples have a voice or a stake at the table? So listening to the presentations and the concerns, laments, also really resonating with the same conversations that we're grappling with in the ocean space, and thinking also that the Western siloed approach to separate ocean from climate conversations is hugely problematic, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for us in totality, and wondering when we will have that opportunity to come together. And that might be a question for George. I don't see him in the room. And whether pre-COP and COP might be an opportunity for us to bring those concerns and issues to the table. How can we work in a more pointed way, noting that we can't separate one from the other? So it was just a comment for Dylan. BB&J, yay, but just like with ICJ. And for Anna, just really curious whether you're aware of, or if there's any interest, or maybe it sparked an interest, I don't know, but really going down this other road so that we are speaking the same language and have equal footing in those important conversations.
Thanks. The reason I'm leaving is because I'm going to the National Security College to give a panel there. But it's a nice link, actually, Francis, to the... So in terms of non-economic loss and damage and cultural loss and damage, Vanuatu is the first country under the Santiago Network to be pursuing a loss and damage policy, a plan, and an implementation plan that then maps out a 10-year minimum kind of horizon to then say, what do we need to do to put in place? And I really like the way that Philomena Nelson from SPREP, she's their loss and damage advisor, the way she talks about it is difficult to quantify. Like, how do you quantify a relationship? How do you quantify spirituality? And how do you quantify knowledge and put a money value to it? So she always talks about what will it take to return that. And in the case of Tuvalu, and we've got Tuvalu sisters in the room, with the Digital Nation 2.0, even just the process of digitizing one's cultural archives and knowledge, what does that cost? And that becomes a way. So I really like the way that they're pursuing that and guiding countries like my own to think about non-economic loss and damage. The second part, which is really opportunistic, and because I'm going to the NSC, is I like to talk about cultural security because I'm capitalizing on the geopolitical competition that is drawing attention into the region, and it's around the security dynamics. And because the Australian government particularly, but also Global North, are using a securitizing language increasingly, and we talk about the concerns of weaponizing processes against us. Well, how can we activate that language of security to bring the attention back to what we really want to talk about? Now, you could say it's quite opportunistic, but what I've observed in the past 3 years is that it is becoming what we've talked about, what I presented about, what I did not really see as very prominent beyond lip service in even regional declarations from the Pacific. I'm starting to see much greater nuance, and people recognizing, because of the ICJ case, because of Tuvalu's Digital Nation 2.0, because of all these stories coming together, actually we are seeing before our eyes rapid loss, and seeing that actually that's part of it's contributing to our insecurity around traditional medicines and so on and so forth. So opportunistic to securitize cultural loss, but perhaps also useful to claim the attention and space that we need to put it there in front of our policymakers, but also external partners. Thank you for letting me rehearse for my panel in 20 minutes.
Thank you. Can we just thank
everybody.
Anna? And then I'll take a last question from Penny, and then Dylan and Rebecca can respond. Last question.
Yep. Thank you, Romitesh. And first of all, thank you to our esteemed panelists. Very thought-provoking presentations. This is a legal question, and I do apologize if this has already been answered in research. I left AEDU 2 years ago, and I haven't been able to keep up to date with recent research. This is on the term existential threat. I do note that as the video that we saw, Cynthia made references to the consequences of climate change being existential. And also in the ICJ-AO, there are quite extensive references to climate change as existential threat. Now, the reason I ask this is because at the moment, I work for the Tuvalu government, and the position has always been that climate change is an existential threat. However, at the UN level, there's been pushbacks on the use of the term existential threat. The other argument was that using existential threat undermines the argument on the permanency of statehood. That's the opposing argument that we've been receiving from consultants at the UN level. Now, Dr. Francis and I were in New York a few weeks ago for the BBNJ PrepCom 3. Now, on the side, there were also ongoing discussions or negotiations on the UN Declaration on Sea Level Rise. And in there, the term existential threat is also in the elements paper, and it has resurfaced that debate amongst not only Pacific countries, but also within the wider small island developing states, the SIDS, under the AOC's umbrella. So my question to you both is, what are your views on the term existential threat and the suitability or the relevance of it continuing to be used within the international fora? Thank you.
Great question. I might regret this response, but I've just got to give you kind of just quick thoughts. With the advisory opinion, a lot of the arguments that Pacific states and organizations put forward were around the PIF's declaration, around recognizing enduring statehood, and the court didn't formally take them up. And the reason, even though that was disappointing because we wanted that kind of recognized in terms of obligations and consequences, the reason for that is because, again, the court can only recognize what states parties have agreed to, not kind of like a regional instrument. There needs to be like a solid jurisprudence around that particular issue for it to kind of acknowledge. So that's something that I imagine is going to be quite fraught. There may be more knowledgeable people, but the idea of the right of, a state to exist and, all that stuff that comes with it is something which is heavily contested and something which does need to be grappled with that declaration and any other kind of treaty negotiations. So, yeah. That's kind of what came to mind when you asked that. It's an unsettled thing, but we'll see, I guess, how that develops. Rebecca, do you have any better insights?
No, I don't have any better insights. But I guess the only other thing I would say is that it is the very role of lawyers to find the opportunities in any ambiguity and use them to pursue justice. So I would like to hope that there's lawyers out there who are also taking these terms and doing whatever they can to pursue both the story of existential threat and enduring statehood.
If you haven't noticed, the Tongans were slowly leaving the room. There's a report launch in Hadley Bull, and also I've been told that there's dancing. So if you want to do some dancing, just grab your afternoon tea, and in Hadley Bull they'll do the report launch for Tonga, and we'll wrap up the conference there. Thank you very much.